The door was already open when Virginia Walker found the room. Not unlocked, not ajar. Open, as if it had been waiting for her, as if the hinges had been held at precisely that angle by some invisible hand anticipating her arrival. She stood in the doorway of Wesley Shelby's ranch house, her traveling bag still gripped in white-knuckled fingers, her dark hair wild from 3 days on a stagecoach, and she looked into that room and felt something crack open inside her chest. It was hers. She knew it the moment her eyes adjusted to the afternoon light pouring through the west-facing window. The vanity mirror angled just so, catching the golden hour without blinding. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed, exactly the kind her mother had kept, exactly the kind Virginia had described in a letter to no one in particular, in a journal she had never sent to anyone. The small shelf beside the window held 3 books, and when she stepped closer, hands trembling, she saw they were the exact 3 volumes she had listed in a letter to her sister Ruth. A letter about what she would want in another life, in a better life. A letter Ruth had called foolish dreaming. On the shelf beside the books was a small glass jar holding dried blue larkspur, the same wildflower her mother had pressed between Bible pages when Virginia was 6 years old. Her throat closed. She turned, and Wesley Shelby was standing in the hallway behind her, hat in hand, watching her with those unreadable gray eyes, and she said the only thing she could manage. "When did you build this room?" He did not answer immediately. That silence was its own kind of confession. "Tell me the truth," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended because fear and wonder had tangled into something that felt dangerously close to accusation. "When did you build this room?" Wesley Shelby looked at the floor, then back at her, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and completely steady, the way a man speaks when he has been carrying a secret so long he has forgotten what it felt like to not carry it. "I built this room for you," he said, "and I know that sounds like a thing a man says, but it is also the truth." She stared at him. "We met 3 days ago," she said, "at the stage depot in Laramie." "Yes," he said. "So explain to me how you built a room for a woman you had never met." And that was when she realized, standing in the doorway of a room that smelled like cedar and larkspur and something she could only call belonging, that the man in front of her had a secret that went far deeper than the room. That somewhere between the dried wildflowers and the precisely angled mirror and the 3 books on the shelf, there was a story she had not been told, a story that involved her, a story that had started before she ever knew his name. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were still holding the traveling bag, and outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the open land like a warning. 3 days earlier, Virginia Walker had stepped off a stagecoach in Laramie, Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1882, with $47, a single traveling bag, a fierce determination not to cry, and absolutely no plan. That last part was the most terrifying. Virginia had grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, the eldest daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who pressed wildflowers in Bible pages, and told her daughters that the world was both harder and more beautiful than anyone gave it credit for. Her father had died of fever in 1878, and her mother had followed 2 years later, a quiet dissolution that Virginia had always privately believed was as much grief as illness. She had spent the 2 years after that taking in sewing work and teaching reading to the children of wealthier families in St. Louis, saving money with the focused desperation of a woman who knew that a woman without family and without money was a woman at the mercy of every circumstance. She had been engaged once. His name was Arthur Belling, and he had been charming and certain, and had the kind of clean hands that made Virginia's mother approve of him immediately. He had also, as it turned out, been engaged to 2 other women simultaneously, a fact Virginia had discovered not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet, humiliating conversation with the wife of Arthur's employer, who had taken pity on her. The betrayal had not broken her. She had been surprised to discover that. It had instead sharpened her, refined her suspicion of easy certainty, made her intensely, sometimes painfully attuned to the gap between what people said and what was actually true. She had come west because her sister Ruth had come west a year earlier, following her own husband to Denver, and had written Virginia letters about space and sky, and the particular kind of freedom that came from being somewhere so large that your past could not quite keep up with you. Virginia had saved for 6 months and bought a ticket that got her as far as Laramie before the combination of unexpected expenses and a minor theft at a stop in Cheyenne reduced her resources to the $47 she was now protecting with the vigilance of someone guarding something irreplaceable. She had a contact in Laramie, a woman named Dolores Hartman who ran a boarding house and had, according to Ruth's letter, a kind heart and a practical mind. What Virginia had not anticipated was that Dolores Hartman had, in the 6 months since Ruth's letter was written, suffered a stroke that left her partially incapacitated and her boarding house temporarily closed to new guests. This Virginia discovered at the depot from the depot master, a heavy-set man named Griggs who delivered the information with such cheerful indifference that she had wanted to sit down on the platform and weep. She did not sit down. She did not weep. She squared her shoulders and turned to survey the town of Laramie, Wyoming territory, which in the spring of 1882 was a place of considerable noise and dust and enterprise, a railroad town that had grown fast and rough and was still in the process of deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. That was when Wesley Shelby had appeared, not dramatically, not as a rescue. He had simply been the man at the end of the depot platform who helped her when her traveling bag caught on the edge of a loose board and wrenched itself out of her grip, spilling 3 weeks of carefully packed life across the dusty platform. He had moved to help before she could protest, gathering her things with quick, careful hands, and when he handed the bag back to him, their eyes met, and Virginia Walker, who was not in the habit of making quick assessments of strangers, thought, with a clarity that startled her, that this was a man who had learned to be careful from experience rather than instruction. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from real work rather than deprivation, with dark hair going gray at the temples and those gray eyes that seemed to be perpetually measuring something. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his middle 30s, perhaps 34 or 35, old enough to carry weight in his face but not old enough to have stopped caring about what he was carrying. Obliged, she said, and that word felt inadequate and formal and exactly right for the distance she wanted to keep. Wesley Shelby, he said, and his voice was lower than she expected, with a faint quality of restraint, as if he had long ago decided that the fewer words you used, the fewer you had to take back. You look like you just received some difficult news. The boarding house I was heading to is closed, she said, and she did not know why she told him this except that his directness invited directness in return. He was quiet for a moment. Dolores Hartman's place, he said. It was not a question. You know it. Laramie is not a large town, he said. I know most things that happen in it. He looked at her with that measuring quality, and she had the odd sensation of being seen more clearly than she was comfortable with. I have a ranch 12 miles east. I have been looking for a woman to manage the household, cook, keep accounts. The position comes with a private room and fair wages. That is an honest offer, and you are free to investigate my reputation in town before you consider it. Virginia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Arthur Belling and his charming certainty. She thought about the $47. She thought about the particular kind of desperation that comes dressed in practicality. What kind of man makes an offer like that to a woman he met 40 seconds ago, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. An honest one, he said, or a fool. You will have to determine which. She had spent 2 days in Laramie asking questions about Wesley Shelby. She spoke to the hardware store owner, a garrulous man named Patterson who seemed to welcome any excuse to stop working. She spoke to the woman at the dry goods store, who was practical and sharp-eyed, and told Virginia that Wesley Shelby paid his debts and kept his word, and was considered by most people in the county to be somewhat difficult but fundamentally decent. She spoke to the deputy sheriff, a young man named Hawkins, who told her that Wesley Shelby had ranched east of Laramie for 6 years and had never once given anyone official cause for complaint. She did not speak to Wesley Shelby during those 2 days, but she saw him twice. Once from across the main street, where he was talking to a man outside the feed store with that careful, precise quality she was already associating with him. Once outside the hotel where she was staying, where she discovered he had paid for an additional night's lodging without telling her, leaving word with the hotel keeper that it was a business advance against her first month's wages, and she should bill any further questions directly to him. This had infuriated her. It had also, she noticed with the self-honest precision she brought to everything, relieved her in a way she did not entirely trust. On the morning of the 3rd day, she had gone to the hotel desk and asked the keeper to inform Mr. Shelby that she would accept his offer and be ready to travel at noon. The ride to the ranch had been mostly silent, which suited her. Wesley drove a wagon with the practiced ease of someone who had made this trip hundreds of times, and Virginia sat with her bag in her lap and watched the Wyoming landscape open around her like a secret being revealed. The high plains, the distant blue line of the mountains, the enormous sky that seemed to operate on a different scale than anything she had known in St. Louis. The space of it was both terrifying and, she was startled to discover, deeply consoling, as if whatever she was carrying might be less heavy out here in all this openness. She had asked him practical questions. How many hands worked the ranch? 4 full-time, 2 more seasonally. What were her specific duties? Managing the kitchen, keeping household accounts, occasionally helping with the books for the cattle operation if she was willing. What were the rules of the household? He had looked at her when she asked this and said there was one, which was that he did not want to be lied to, and that if she had a problem with him she should say it to his face. She had said that was also her preference. He had nodded as if they had agreed on something important. She had not asked about his past. The darkness around certain subjects in his expression told her clearly enough that there were things he was not yet ready to offer, and she had long ago learned that the secrets a person keeps in the first conversation are rarely the most interesting ones. The interesting secrets, the ones that actually mattered, came later, or not at all. The ranch itself had surprised her. She had been picturing something rough and provisional, a working operation with no thought given to anything beyond function. What she found instead was a property that had been built with a particular kind of care, the kind that comes from someone who has thought hard about what permanence means. The main house was solid and well-maintained, the barn large and neatly organized, the kitchen garden behind the house already showing spring growth. There were curtains in the windows, she noticed. Not pretty curtains, but curtains, as if someone had once considered comfort. She asked about this carefully. "My wife," he said. "She died 4 years ago." And that was all he said, and she did not push. And they walked into the house together, and he showed her the kitchen and the main room and the small study where he kept the ranch accounts. And then he showed her the hallway leading to the back of the house, and opened the door to a room that had been waiting for her. And now she was standing in the doorway of that room, and he had just told her he had built it for her, and she was trying to understand what that meant without letting the fear of what it might mean swallow her entirely. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. She set her traveling bag on the cedar chest, because her arms were tired of holding it, and also because something about setting it down felt like a commitment to staying long enough to hear the truth. "I'm not easily frightened, but I need the truth." Wesley Shelby came and sat in the single wooden chair beside the window, and he turned his hat in his hands with the slow, deliberate motion of a man organizing his thoughts. "My wife's name was Catherine," he said. "She died of a fever in the winter of 1878. We had been married 3 years. She was 26 years old." He said this the way people say things that have been said so many times they have become a kind of stone, worn smooth by repetition. "After she died, I kept the ranch going because there was nothing else to do with the days. I am not a man who manages grief by stopping." Virginia nodded slowly. She understood this. About a year after she died, he continued, I began to think about what this place needed, not just for the operation, for the living of it. Catherine had made it livable, and when she was gone, I could feel the absence of that as something almost physical. He paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man who was lonely, she said, and who was honest with himself about it. He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise. There is a woman in Denver I have never met, he said, who writes a column for a newspaper. Advice for settlers, domestic economy, that sort of thing. Her name is listed only as VW. She wrote a series last year about what a proper home requires to sustain a family through a hard winter. Not just practical supplies, but things of comfort. The particular objects that make a space feel like it was built for a person rather than just occupied by one. He stopped. Virginia went very still. VW Virginia Walker. She had been writing that column under her initials since the summer of 1881. Supplementing her sewing income with the small fees the Denver paper paid, writing about domestic life with the careful precision of someone who had observed it closely and thought hard about what mattered. You read my column, she said. Several of the issues. The one from October described the ideal bedroom in terms so particular they could only have come from someone with a genuine vision of it. He met her eyes. The cedar chest, the west-facing window for afternoon light, the books, the jar of dried flowers. She sat down on the edge of the bed because her knees had decided this was a reasonable response to the situation. You built this from a newspaper column, she said. I started the room in November, he said. I had no intention of ever meeting VW. It was not a plan. It was more that I had read the words and thought, yes, this is what a room should be. This is the standard I should build toward. He paused. The larkspur was my own addition. There was a field of it here 2 summers ago, and I dried some. Another pause. When I met you at the depot and you told me your name, I did not connect it immediately. It was only later, on the drive out here, when you mentioned having a sister in Denver, that it began to fit together. Virginia realized she had stopped breathing at some point during this explanation. She made herself breathe. Why didn't you tell me at once, she said. Because I was afraid, he said, that it would sound precisely as strange as it sounds. She looked around the room, the jar of larkspur, the cedar chest, the angled mirror. She thought about the difference between a trap and a coincidence, and something that did not have a clean name yet. Something in between that felt like the universe making an argument she was not sure she was ready to hear. It does sound strange, she said. Yes, he said. It is also, she said carefully, not what I would call a hidden motive. A hidden motive implies deception. What you are describing is closer to, she searched for the word, preparation, without knowing what you were preparing for. He looked at her steadily. That is a generous reading of it. I am not being generous, she said. I am being precise. She stood up and moved to the window and looked out at the land, the long grass moving in the afternoon wind, the mountains blue and distant and permanent. I need some time to think. I would like to begin the work I agreed to begin, and I would like us to proceed carefully. That is all I am asking, he said. He left her in the room with her bag and the larkspur and the tilted afternoon light, and Virginia Walker stood at the west-facing window and felt the complicated weight of being known, even in part, even obliquely, by a man she had met 3 days ago in a dusty rail town, and tried to figure out whether that weight was a burden or something else entirely. She began work the next morning as if the conversation of the previous evening had not fundamentally altered the landscape. This was a choice, and a conscious one. Virginia was a practical woman, and practical women understood that revelations, however startling, did not pay wages or cook meals or keep ledgers. You absorbed the startling thing, and you kept working, and you let understanding come at its own pace rather than forcing it. The kitchen at the Shelby Ranch was well-stocked and sensibly organized, which told her something about Wesley. A man who did not care about domestic order let kitchens become chaotic. The orderliness here had the slightly impersonal quality of someone maintaining standards rather than living in the space, which she found both explanatory and quietly sad. She cooked breakfast that first morning, simple and good, eggs and bread, and the first of the spring onions from the kitchen garden. Wesley came in from checking the cattle at sunrise, washed his hands at the basin, sat down, and thanked her for the meal with a brief, formal sincerity that made the ranch hands at the long table look at each other in what she recognized as mild surprise. She filed this away as information. The ranch hands were a varied group. There was Tomás, a Mexican vaquero in his 40s, who was clearly the most skilled horseman among them and who treated Virginia with a courteous wariness that suggested he had learned to be careful around new developments at the ranch. There was Pete, who was young and talkative and told her within the first hour that he had come from Ohio and still wasn't sure Wyoming was worth the trouble. There were two brothers named Reed and Coleman Marsh, quiet and steady, who communicated more through glance and gesture than words. And there was an older man everyone called Sutton, who had worked for Wesley the longest and who watched everything with faded blue eyes that missed nothing. Sutton was the one who told her things. Not because he was indiscreet, she came to understand, but because he had made a judgment about her in the first few days and decided she was trustworthy enough to be given context. He told her about Catherine, Wesley's first wife. She had been, by Sutton's account, a bright and vigorous woman who had genuinely loved the ranch and the work of it, and whose death had left Wesley not broken exactly but hollowed. He kept going, Sutton said, on the third morning, while Virginia was baking bread and he was supposedly repairing a piece of harness but actually providing oral history. Kept the operation sound, kept his word to everyone, but there was something that went out of him. Like a lamp that's still standing but the oil's been emptied. And then, Virginia said, because there was clearly an and then nothing for 4 years, Sutton said. And then he built that room. Virginia kept her hands in the bread dough and did not look up. Did he explain it to anyone, she asked. No, Sutton said. We all figured he'd lost his head a little. Grief does that sometimes, makes a man do something particular that doesn't have a clear explanation. Pete thought maybe he was planning to take in a boarder. Reed thought he'd maybe met a woman in town and none of us knew, but he hadn't met anyone. He built the room and it sat there and he never talked about it, and then one day he went to Laramie to get supplies and came back with you. Virginia absorbed this. Does that alarm you, she said, as a sequence of events? Sutton considered this with genuine seriousness. Been watching Wesley Shelby for 6 years, he said finally. He is not a man who does things without reason. His reasons are sometimes his own business and you don't always get to know them, but they exist. He stood up with the harness piece. That is my opinion for what it is worth. Virginia's days fell into a rhythm that she found, to her surprise, genuinely satisfying. The kitchen work she did well and quickly, leaving herself time in the afternoons to sit with the ranch accounts, which had been kept with reasonable competence, but without the systematic organization that would make them truly useful. She began reorganizing them with a quiet thoroughness that she could see pleased Wesley, though he did not say so in so many words. He said it in the way he stopped in the study doorway and looked at what she was doing with an expression that contained something she was gradually learning to read. Wesley Shelby was not a demonstrative man. He had not been raised in a world that valued open expression of feeling and had not had, it seemed, a great deal of experience with receiving it. But he was not cold. He was, she was coming to understand, a man who had built a very strong wall between himself and the possibility of loss, because he had experienced loss in a way that had convinced him the wall was necessary for survival. The difficulty was that the same wall that kept loss out also kept everything else out as well. She saw this and did not push. She worked alongside him in the space he gave her and waited. In the evenings, they sometimes sat on the porch as the light faded and the stars came out with the extravagant generosity of the Wyoming sky, which had more stars in it than Virginia had ever believed possible. They talked about practical things at first. The state of the cattle operation, the price of beef in Cheyenne, the ongoing questions about statehood for the territory, which people in Wyoming seem to feel very strongly about in various directions. Then, gradually, other things. He asked about her writing. She told him about starting the column, about how she had wanted to write about domestic life as a genuine subject worthy of serious thought rather than something assumed to require no thought at all. He listened in the attentive way that she was coming to identify as his particular form of engagement, the way his whole body oriented toward the speaker, the way he did not fill silences with unnecessary words. She asked about the ranch, about how he had come to Wyoming. He had been born in Virginia, she discovered, which explained the measured quality of his speech, a faint tidewater formality that had mostly been worn away by years of Western life but left traces. He had come west in 1871 at the age of 23 with his brother who had died in an accident on the trail, and had arrived in Wyoming alone and built something from the ground up over 11 years that he could be justifiably proud of. "You lost your brother on the way here," she said one evening, "and then your wife 4 years after that." "Yes," he said. "That is a great deal of loss," she said. "Yes," he said again. And then, after a long pause, "It teaches you things." "What things?" He thought about this for long enough that she did not expect an answer. "It teaches you," he said at last, "that the worst thing you can do is to stop wanting things because wanting things is dangerous. Because if you stop wanting things, you stop building them. And if you stop building things, all you have left is what you are protecting. And you can spend a whole life protecting something that has nothing inside it." She turned to look at him in the near darkness. He was looking out at the land the way he always did when he said something important, as if the land gave him somewhere to put his eyes when the words were too much. "Is that what the room was?" she asked. "Building something instead of protecting nothing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something like that," he said. The weeks passed. May opened into June, and June brought the particular beauty of Wyoming in early summer, the grass long and green, the sky a shade of blue that Virginia had no prior reference for. She planted more in the kitchen garden, organized the household with increasing efficiency, continued reorganizing the ranch accounts in a way that began to save Wesley measurable amounts of money through better tracking and renegotiated supply relationships she had identified as overpriced. She also wrote. She continued her column for the Denver paper, mailing her pieces on the twice-weekly mail run, and began also keeping a private journal that was more honest than the column, the raw material of her thinking. She wrote in the journal about the ranch and about Wesley, and about the complicated business of being a woman alone in a man's world, about the way she was simultaneously dependent on Wesley's employment and deeply invested in demonstrating her own competence, about the odd safety of the room he had built. One afternoon in late June, she was writing in her journal on the porch when Wesley came up from the barn and stopped when he saw her writing, and stood for a moment in an attitude of such careful restraint, trying so clearly not to seem as if he was paying her particular attention, that she almost laughed. "You can ask," she said. He came and sat in the other porch chair. "What do you write there?" he said. "The journal, not the column." "Whatever is true," she said. "Things I have not yet decided how to say out loud." "Is there much of that?" She looked at him. "Currently," she said, "yes." He held her gaze for a moment, and she felt the precise quality of that look, the measured intensity of a man who had learned to be very careful with hope. "Virginia," he said, and her name in his voice had a particular quality that she felt somewhere below her throat. "Not yet," she said, not unkindly. "I need more time." "I know," he said. "I am not rushing anything." She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. She believed him completely. The trouble came in late July, arriving in the form of a man named Aldous Crane, who rode onto the Shelby property on a Tuesday afternoon on a chestnut horse that looked better fed than Crane himself. Crane was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of surface pleasantness that Virginia's well-developed instincts read immediately as performance. He wore good clothes and a practiced smile, and shook Wesley's hand with the excessive warmth of someone who needed something. She learned later, piecing it together from what Wesley told her and what she had understood by watching, that Aldous Crane was a man who had been trying for 2 years to purchase the Shelby Ranch, or, failing that, to establish some kind of leveraged relationship with it. The land Wesley had was positioned in a way that controlled water access for several surrounding properties, and Crane, who had ambitions of creating a larger consolidated operation, needed it. Wesley had declined every previous approach with a directness that had apparently not discouraged Crane so much as refined his strategy. The refined strategy, Virginia understood at the supper table that evening, was her. Crane stayed for supper in the way that uninvited guests at remote ranch houses often did, because the rules of Western hospitality were still strong enough that turning someone away from your table required a reason more explicit than not wanting them there. He was charming throughout the meal, attentive to Virginia in a way that walked right up to the edge of impropriety without technically crossing it, asking about her background and her writing with an interest that she recognized immediately as instrumental rather than genuine. After supper he proposed, with great smoothness, that Virginia might like to see the town of Laramie more often, perhaps visit on Saturdays, perhaps make use of certain social opportunities that he could facilitate. He was proposing, in the vocabulary of the time and place, to court her. He was using the potential of a romantic interest in her as leverage to create a relationship with Wesley that Wesley had been refusing to allow. If Virginia became socially connected to Crane, Wesley would be obligated to be more accommodating. It was a manipulation dressed in polite clothes, and it required her cooperation. She looked at Crane across the table, and then looked at Wesley and saw in Wesley's face a contained fury that was being held with enormous effort, because hitting a guest at your own table was not something you did. And then she looked back at Crane and said, pleasantly, that she appreciated his interest but that her time was already quite fully occupied by the ranch accounts, which were extensive, and that she was afraid she would not be a satisfactory companion for social occasions, as she was rather absorbed in her work, and tended to want to talk about bookkeeping when what people actually wanted was light conversation. Pete, who was 22 and had been watching this with the barely contained glee of someone seeing a complicated social situation managed deftly, made a sound into his coffee that might have been a suppressed laugh. Crane left that evening with the forced good grace of someone recalculating his approach, and Wesley came and found her in the study where she had retreated to the accounts and stood in the doorway for a moment. "I should have managed that differently," he said. "I should not have let him in." "He would have interpreted being turned away as aggression," she said. "This way he just ran into a wall he hadn't mapped. He will reassess." Wesley looked at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "St. Louis," she said. "A woman alone in a city learns to be careful about direct confrontation and very effective with indirect methods." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" She was surprised enough by this that she looked up from the ledger. Wesley asking about her internal state directly was not common. He paid attention to everything, but the paying attention had mostly lived in action, in small practical provisions, in the ensuring of things rather than the asking about them. "I am fine," she said. "I am a little angry, but anger is a clean feeling. It does not linger." "Unlike what?" She looked at him carefully. "Unlike fear," she said. "Which does?" He came fully into the room and sat down across from her at the desk, and she had the sense of a man deciding to cross a line he had been standing on for a long time. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Here." "No," she said, and she meant it. "Not of the ranch, not of you." She paused. "I am afraid of what I have begun to feel, which is a more complicated matter." His expression did not change, but something behind it did, like light shifting behind a closed window. "What have you begun to feel?" he asked, and his voice had that careful quality she had come to treasure, the quality of a man who asks a question he genuinely does not know the answer to and is genuinely prepared to hear any answer that comes. She thought about Arthur Belling, who had told her she was beautiful and clever and indispensable, and had been saying the same things to two other women. She thought about the room with the cedar chest and the larkspur. She thought about the way Wesley had said her name 3 weeks ago on the porch, Virginia, with that low particular weight. "I have begun to feel," she said slowly, "that this is a place I might actually be able to stop in, not as an employment situation, as something more permanent." She met his eyes, and I find that terrifying because permanence requires trust, and trust requires me to believe that what I see is what is true. "It is," he said. "Tell me about Catherine," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had pushed too far. Then he began to talk. He told her about meeting Catherine Howell in 1874 when she had come with her family to settle land east of the ranch. He told her about the courtship, which had been straightforward and genuine, two practical people who had recognized in each other something worth building toward. He told her about the 3 years of marriage, which had been good years, years of real partnership and real affection, not without difficulty, but with the kind of fundamental coherence that makes difficulty manageable. He told her about the fever, the horrible swift progression of it, the 3 days in which it became clear nothing was going to be enough. He told her about the morning after she died, walking out into the land and not knowing for the first time in years what he was working toward, and how he had made himself answer that question every day since then, until the answer was something sturdy enough to stand on. "I am not asking you to replace her," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Catherine was who she was and you are who you are, and those are different things. I'm not looking for a substitute." "What are you looking for?" Virginia asked. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "Someone to build something with," he said. "Someone who wants to build the same kind of thing." She felt the force of that simplicity like something physical, not poetic language, not elaborate courtship rhetoric. The plain truth of what he wanted stated in terms that she could evaluate for accuracy. She stood up from the desk and crossed to the window and looked out at the Wyoming night. The stars were doing their extravagant thing. The land was dark and enormous and honest. "I have been afraid," she said, "since Arthur Belling, of being fooled by certainty, of being convinced by a man who sounds true, and then being wrong." "That is a reasonable fear," Wesley said from behind her. "I know," she said. "What I am trying to work out is whether being afraid of being fooled is going to keep me from something real." "I cannot tell you that," he said. "That is only yours to know." She turned around. He was still at the desk, not having moved toward her, maintaining the space she had established as hers, and she felt something resolve inside her, some tightly held resistance that she had not quite admitted to holding. "I am going to go to my room," she said, "and think." "All right," he said. "And tomorrow," she said, "I think we might begin to talk differently." She saw the shift in his face, the very precise and contained way he absorbed this. "All right," he said again. And she could hear in those 2 words everything he was not saying yet, the whole careful structure of what he had been hoping for, held with that characteristic discipline until she was ready to hear it. She went to her room, the room he had built from the ghost of her words, and lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the enormous, frightening, genuine thing that was happening to her with complete clear-eyed awareness, and decided that for once the frightening thing might be the right thing, and that being a practical woman did not mean being a fearful one. In the morning she came down to breakfast before anyone else and made coffee and was standing at the kitchen window when Wesley came in from the barn at first light, and when he saw her there in the early morning he stopped in the doorway, and she turned and said, "Good morning," and something in the way she said it was different from every previous morning. He heard it. She could see that he heard it. "Good morning," he said, and crossed the kitchen and took the coffee she offered him, and their hands were close together for a moment, and she did not move hers away, and he looked at her over the rim of the cup with those gray eyes that she had begun to think she could look at for a very long time. August arrived with fierce heat and the constant work of summer on a cattle operation, and Virginia and Wesley moved through it together in a way that had shifted unmistakably. They were not yet lovers, not yet what you would call openly courting in the formal sense, but they were something. They talked more and more honestly, the kind of talking that maps the interior of another person and deposits you both in new territory. They worked alongside each other with the easy coordination of people whose rhythms have aligned. She began to know which silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he was troubled, and which were simply the comfortable silence of someone who does not need to fill space. He began small gestures. He was not a romantic man in the traditional sense, did not bring flowers or compose speeches. What he did was notice. He noticed that she found the afternoon heat difficult and rearranged the day's schedule so that the lightest tasks fell in the afternoon and the heavier ones in the cooler morning. He noticed that she was running low on writing materials and arranged for a supply from Laramie without being asked. He noticed, with an observation that made her stop and sit down when she discovered it, that she had been looking in her third-day letters to Ruth for a specific kind of seed she had described as her mother's favorite, and he had ordered that seed from a Cheyenne supplier and had it delivered without telling her, leaving it simply on the kitchen table one morning with no note at all, because he was not a man who needed credit for kindness. She sat down at the kitchen table with the packet of seeds and felt love move through her like weather, like the wind that came off the mountains some evenings with a smell of something clean and cold, and impossibly far away. She told him that evening on the porch, not the whole of it, not all at once. She said, "You noticed the seeds," and he said, "Yes," and she said, "I would like you to know that I have been thinking about this with more and more clarity over the last few weeks, and what I am clear about is that I care about you, Wesley, more than I expected to. More than I thought was possible for me in this amount of time." He turned his head toward her slowly, and in the long summer evening light his face had an expression she had not seen before, an expression in which all the careful restraint was simply gone, stripped away by something too strong to be managed, and what was underneath was not frightening at all. It was a longing so honest it was almost painful to see, because it was the longing of a man who had been very patient for a very long time, and was only now allowing himself to believe that the waiting might end. "Virginia," he said. "I know," she said, "I know." He reached out and took her hand and held it, and they sat there in the fading light with their hands together, the Wyoming stars coming up one by one in the darkening sky, and Virginia thought about the room with the cedar chest and the larkspur, and the column she had written in a rented room in St. Louis, and the $47, and the stagecoach, and the loose board on the depot platform, and all the thousand specific things that had to be exactly as they were for this particular evening to happen. And she thought that some things were too precisely arranged to be called coincidence, and too unplanned to be called design, and that perhaps what you called them was grace. They did not kiss that evening. They sat and talked long into the night, and then she went to her room and he went to his, but the space between them had been crossed in the way that matters, the internal way, the way that makes everything afterward different. In September, Aldous Crane returned. He came this time with paperwork, which meant he had moved from social manipulation to legal pressure. He arrived on a Friday morning with a man Virginia, identified immediately as a lawyer by the quality of his clothes and the careful way he carried a briefcase, and he sat down in Wesley's main room and presented what he described as a claim on the water rights to the eastern stream that ran through the ranch property. The claim was, Virginia determined by looking at it carefully over the next 2 hours while Wesley and Crane sat in a charged and difficult silence, based on a recorded deed from 1879 that referenced water access rights that had allegedly been agreed upon in a verbal arrangement with Wesley's predecessor's estate. It was the kind of claim that was not clearly fraudulent, but was also not clearly valid, designed to create enough legal uncertainty to force a negotiation on Crane's terms. She knew this tactic. It was the same tactic Arthur Belling had used against a business partner, she had heard, after his multiple engagements were exposed. Create enough legal noise that the victim agrees to terms just to make the noise stop. She sat down with the paperwork and the ranch accounts, and spent the afternoon building a counterargument, tracing the clear chain of water rights through the original territorial land grants, the county records, and the survey maps Wesley had kept with his other documents. She found what she needed by early evening, a document that predated Crane's claimed verbal arrangement by 7 years and established the water rights unambiguously with the ranch property. She brought it to Wesley and laid it on the table in front of Crane's lawyer and said, calmly, that she believed this resolved the question. The lawyer looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Crane. Then he packed up his briefcase with the deliberate, careful movements of someone who was about to give advice that would not be welcome. Crane looked at Virginia with an expression that was briefly, rawly unpleasant before being smoothed back into the polished surface he preferred to present. "You are remarkably well informed for a household employee," he said. "I manage the accounts," she said. "It would be strange not to be." He left with his lawyer, and Wesley came and stood beside her and looked at the documents still spread on the table and then at her and said, with a quietness that was entirely distinct from his usual quietness, a quietness that had weight in it, "Thank you." "It was in the records," she said. "He must have known it was there." "He knew I might not think to look," Wesley said, "or not quickly enough." She put the documents carefully away in the proper order and felt the satisfying click of a thing properly resolved, and then felt Wesley's hand on her shoulder, and turned, and this time he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has been patient for a long time and has just watched the woman he loves manage a genuine threat with extraordinary competence, and who has finally decided that the waiting is over. It was warm and direct and entirely honest, the way everything about him was eventually honest, and Virginia put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not as steady as he would have liked to appear, and kissed him back with the full conviction of a woman who has thought this through and made a decision she intends to keep. When they separated, he was looking at her with that expression, the one with all the restraint gone. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since roughly the 3rd week of June." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you try very hard not to show it. When did you know for yourself?" She thought about the morning she had come down to breakfast and made coffee and felt, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "August," she said, "when I found the seeds on the table." He nodded slowly, as if this made sense in a way that satisfied something in his private accounting of the situation. "The seeds," he said. "You left them without a note," she said. "That was what did it." Because a man who leaves a gift without wanting credit for it is a man who gives because the giving matters, not the recognition. She paused. "That is a rare quality." He looked at her for a long moment. "Virginia Walker," he said. "Wesley Shelby," she answered. And they stood there in the evening light of the ranch house study, with the documents properly filed and the threat of Aldous Crane properly addressed, and Virginia understood that they had arrived somewhere together that neither of them had been able to entirely plan for or predict, and that arriving there together was its own kind of miracle. October on the Wyoming plains was spectacular and demanding. The cattle operation moved into its fall work, the roundup, the culling, the preparation for winter. Virginia was in the thick of all of it, managing the supply logistics and the account-keeping with an efficiency that the ranch hands had by now entirely accepted, and Sutton had taken to quietly bragging about to anyone in Laramie who would listen. She and Wesley had settled into a relationship that was both public within the ranch community and carefully considered in terms of what came next. There were conversations on the porch in the evenings that went deeper than any Virginia had expected to have with any man. Conversations about the future of the ranch, about what they each wanted from the next decade. about children which she had believed herself past expecting, and which Wesley raised one evening with a directness that was characteristic of him, and that moved her more than she anticipated. "I would like a family," he said, "if you want to know my honest position on it. Children, if that is possible and if you want it. I am not placing that as a requirement of anything. I am telling you because you deserve to know what I am hoping for." She thought about it. She was 29 years old. It was 1882, and she was in good health, and she had, despite everything, not stopped wanting a family of her own. The life she had been living in St. Louis had not offered any realistic path to it, and she had been gradually, painfully, making peace with that fact. "I wanted to," she said. "I did not think I would be able to say that and mean it about anyone after the last few years, but I mean it." He reached across and took her hand in the way that had become their language for the things too large for words. "Then we should get married," he said. She looked at him. Was that a proposal? He appeared to think this over. "It was an honest statement of my preferred outcome," he said. "If you want a formal proposal, I can make one. Will it be very different from what you just said?" "Probably not," he admitted. "I am not much for ornate speeches." "No," she agreed. "You are not." She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." They were married in November of 1882 in Laramie, in the small white church that had been built 3 years earlier by a congregation that was still arguing about whether to affiliate with any particular denomination, and had decided in the meantime that the building itself was ecumenical enough to stand on its own. The minister was a practical man named Fellows who conducted the ceremony with warmth and efficiency, and the witnesses were Sutton and the wife of the hardware store owner Patterson, a small capable woman named Elspeth who had taken a personal interest in Virginia's situation since the beginning. Pete cried, which he later denied with such vehemence that it became the primary topic of conversation among the ranch hands for several weeks. The reception was held at the ranch, a simple and genuinely joyful occasion with food that Virginia had organized, and the musical contribution of Reed Marsh, who turned out to play the fiddle with considerable talent. People came from 3 surrounding ranches and from town, and the gathering had the particular quality of a celebration that is also a ratification, a community confirming what it already knew. That evening, after everyone had gone and the last lamp in the bunkhouse had gone dark, Virginia and Wesley stood together on the porch looking at the stars, and she felt the wholeness of the moment with an almost unbearable sharpness, the way the most complete things sometimes feel on the edge of something very large. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how many things had to happen exactly as they did." "Yes," he said. He had his arm around her, her head against his shoulder. "If my plans had not fallen through in St. Louis, if Dolores Hartman had not been unwell, if the board on the depot platform had been properly nailed, if I had not been reading a Denver newspaper in the October of 1881, he said. She tilted her head to look at him. "Did you keep the issue?" He looked at her. "Which issue?" "The one with my column in it, the one you built the room from." A pause. "Virginia," he said, "you kept it. I may have kept several issues." She made a sound that was somewhere between laughter and something warmer. "Show me," she said. He brought her inside to the study, and in the bottom drawer of his desk, in a careful folded arrangement that was unmistakably deliberate, were 6 copies of the Denver newspaper, each folded open to the column marked VW, dated between August and December of 1881. The October issue was the most worn, its edges soft from handling. She held it in her hands and read her own words from 14 months ago, words about the cedar chest and the west-facing window and the shelf of books, and felt the strange, vertiginous quality of a life that had doubled back on itself, of the way something she had written in a rented room in St. Louis had become the bones of the room she lived in now. "Wesley," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. She had said it before in the weeks since September, but this time it had the particular weight of all the things she now understood, the full architecture of what had happened between them, the strange and specific grace of it. "I love you," he said. and he took the newspaper gently from her hands and set it on the desk and put his arms around her. And outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the grass with its characteristic honesty, and the stars kept their extravagant appointment with the night sky. And Virginia Walker Shelby leaned against the man who had built a room from the echo of her own longing, and thought that the world was, as her mother had always said, both harder and more beautiful than anyone gave it credit for. Their first winter together was hard, the way Wyoming winters were always hard, with a sustained cold that came down from the mountains and required the constant vigilance of both the cattle operation and the household. Virginia managed the winter stores with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, and they discovered in that first season of genuine hardship together that they were extraordinarily well suited for difficulty. They did not panic. They did not blame each other. They worked through problems with the methodical partnership of two people who had each, separately, learned that panic was expensive and clarity was cheap. The spring of 1883 brought Virginia news that she was pregnant, which she confirmed with the help of a woman doctor in Laramie named Agnes Teller, one of the very few women practicing medicine in Wyoming Territory, who confirmed it with brisk professional certainty and told Virginia she was in excellent health and should expect no particular difficulties. She told Wesley that evening and watched him sit very still with the information for almost a full minute, during which his face went through several things she could not entirely name, and then he looked at her with an expression of such uncontained happiness that she felt her throat close with the force of it. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up and came to her and held her with a gentleness that was its own kind of eloquence, and she held him back and felt the future shift and open, taking on a shape that was larger and more particular than anything she had imagined from a rented room in St. Louis. Their son was born in October of 1883, a healthy boy whom they named Thomas after Wesley's brother who had died on the trail. Thomas Shelby arrived in the world with considerable force, and a disposition that was, from the first weeks, clearly his own, a combination of Wesley's observational stillness and Virginia's sharp directness that Sutton claimed with great authority was exactly what you would expect from parents of that particular type. Pete held the baby with the overcautious terror of a young man who has not held babies before and is extremely afraid of breaking them. And then, when the baby looked at him with the focused blankness of a new person encountering the world, laughed with pure delight and stopped being terrified. Virginia wrote about Thomas in her journal and in letters to Ruth, who had by now 2 children of her own in Denver, and who wrote back letters of such warm, generous happiness that Virginia read them multiple times. She also, after some consideration, wrote about Thomas in her column for the Denver paper, in a piece about the particular education of having a child, the way it reorganizes everything you know about what matters, the way the world looks different when there is a new person in it who is specifically yours to love and teach. The response to that column was the largest she had ever received, letters forwarded from the paper's office in small batches throughout the winter, women writing to say yes, exactly. This is what it is. You have said the thing I could not say. She showed one batch of letters to Wesley on an evening in January of 1884, Thomas asleep in the small bed they had added to the room at the back of the house, the fire burning steadily in the main room, the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind did in January. "These women are lonely," she said. "That is what they are actually saying. They are saying that what they do does not have a name that gives it value." "That is what your column gives them," Wesley said. "The name." She looked at him. "You have been reading my columns regularly." "Since October of 1881, he said, and something in the timing of that made her laugh, the old pleasure of the story of themselves, which had not gotten old. She continued writing throughout the years that followed, expanding the column into something that the Denver paper eventually gave a dedicated page, a full domestic and social commentary that addressed the realities of life in the West for women and families, with a clear-eyed honesty that was sometimes controversial and always read. She became, within the correspondence networks of the region, a recognized voice, a woman whose words were passed from ranch to ranch and town to town, along with the newspapers they arrived in. Wesley read everything she wrote. He never said much about it directly, but she could always tell when a piece had moved him by the particular quality of his silence the evening after the paper arrived, the way he sat with whatever she had written for longer than was strictly necessary, the way his eyes had that inward look of someone still thinking. By the spring of 1885, the ranch had grown. Wesley had purchased the adjacent parcel on the eastern side, expanding the operation in a way that required additional hands and more complex logistics. He had also, with Virginia's help on the financial structuring, negotiated a favorable arrangement with a Cheyenne buyer that improved their yearly returns significantly. They were not wealthy by Eastern standards, but they were secure, which was a different and in some ways more satisfying thing. Aldous Crane had tried one more approach, in the summer of 1884, this time attempting to use a conflict over grazing boundaries as leverage, and had been met with such comprehensively documented and legally airtight responses from both Wesley and the attorney they now retained in Laramie that he had abandoned the effort entirely and eventually sold his own operation and moved to Colorado, which was where, according to the occasional gossip that traveled through the region, he was attempting the same strategies with new targets. Virginia felt no triumph about this. She felt the clean satisfaction of a completed thing, of a threat properly resolved, and then moved on. Sutton retired from active ranch work in the fall of 1885, settling in Laramie in a small house he had been saving toward for most of a decade, and his going-away gathering at the ranch was attended by most of the county, and involved a speech from Virginia that made the old man cry in the dignified way of someone not accustomed to being publicly appreciated, which is to say with the tears contained to the eyes and the jaw held very steady. Tomás, the vaquero, had become over the years something more like family than employee, a man whose judgment Wesley trusted absolutely, and whose skill with horses had become somewhat legendary in the region. He stayed and brought a younger brother named Carlos to join the operation, and the Shelby Ranch became the kind of place known for treating its workers with fair wages and basic dignity, which was not universal in the cattle country of Wyoming territory, and which Virginia had insisted upon from early in their marriage with a firmness that Wesley had supported entirely. Their second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl whom they named Rose, after Virginia's mother whose full name had been Rosemary. Rose arrived with the same comprehensive force as her brother, but with an expression from the very beginning that suggested she was assessing the situation and finding it provisionally acceptable, subject to review. Wesley held his daughter for the first time with the expression of a man who has been presented with something he did not know he was waiting for, and Virginia, watching from the bed, thought that some kinds of happiness simply defy description, and you have to just be inside them. Thomas, who was 2 years and a half when Rose arrived, inspected his sister with careful seriousness, and then announced that she was very small, which was accurate, and that her hands looked like his hands except very small, which was also accurate, and then went back to what he had been doing, which was attempting to teach the barn cat a game of his own devising that the cat was tolerating with various degrees of patience. That summer, with a toddler and an infant and the full weight of the ranch operation's high season, life was full to the point where it sometimes felt like there was no room for anything else, and then somehow there always was. Virginia organized, managed, wrote, cooked, kept accounts, nursed her daughter, answered her son's questions about everything in the world with the same genuine engagement she had once given to students in St. Louis, and fell into bed at night with a tiredness that was the satisfying kind, the kind that knows what it was earned by. Wesley, who had spent years learning to express feeling through action rather than language, was learning slowly with her help to also use words. Not many words and not elaborate ones, but the specific ones that mattered. He told her he was proud of her, which was the kind of thing she had not heard from anyone, and which arrived with unexpected force the first time he said it, sitting at the table looking at a particularly fine piece she had written, looking at her across the newspaper with those steady gray eyes. He told her he was grateful for her, which was different from loving her, and also true, and also something that people rarely said to each other directly in a world that considered direct emotional expression somewhat suspicious. He told her, on a Tuesday evening in August of 1886 when the children were asleep, and the moon was doing something extraordinary over the mountains, that the life they had built together was the best thing he had ever known, and that he had not believed it was possible for him after Catherine, and that he had been wrong to give up on the possibility, and that he was glad the deposit platform board had been loose. She laughed. She loved his ability to locate the precise mechanical hinge of a thing. "I am glad," she said, "that you read the Denver paper. I am glad," he said, "that you had the particular vision you had about cedar chests and west-facing windows. I am glad," she said, "that you are a man who builds things instead of a man who only protects things." He was quiet for a moment. "You said that early on," he said, "about the difference between building and protecting." "I remember," she said. "It was the thing," he said, "that told me you actually understood what I was trying to be." The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty or sorrow but with an underlying coherence that holds through both. Thomas grew into a boy of remarkable curiosity, attending the school that had been established in the county, and supplemented by everything Virginia could give him from the library she had been steadily building in the study, which now had 2 full shelves and was threatening to require a third. Rose grew into a child of ferocious personality and considerable charm, qualities that she seemed to deploy simultaneously and with great effectiveness. In the spring of 1888, Wyoming Territory was moving toward statehood with increasing momentum, and Virginia wrote a series of columns about what statehood would mean for women in the territory, which had since 1869 been remarkable in granting women the right to vote and serve on juries, an equality that Virginia wrote about with both pride and clear-eyed attention to how much further there was still to go. These columns brought her into correspondence with women in other territories and states who were working on the same questions, and she began to be a figure in a wider conversation about women's lives and women's rights that extended beyond domestic columns into something more explicitly political. This was territory that required care, because the world of 1888 was not universally welcoming to women who spoke publicly about the shape of their own lives, and Virginia navigated it with the same combination of precision and strategic indirection she had always brought to difficult situations. Wesley read these columns too. When she worried privately that the more explicitly political pieces would draw negative attention to the ranch or to him, he was characteristically direct about it. "Your opinions are your own," he said. "I married you knowing what kind of mind you have. I would not change it, and I would not ask you to hide it." She felt this the way she felt all his most important things, as a shift in her own gravity, a slight adjustment in the axis of the world. "Some people in town are uncomfortable with the voting pieces," she said. "Some people in town," he said, "are uncomfortable with anything that suggests the world might be different from how they currently prefer it to be." He looked at her with his steady eyes. "Write what is true. I will manage the rest." She wrote what was true. Wyoming became a state on July 10, 1890, and Virginia wrote the day it happened, wrote about what it meant to have been part of a place during its formation, about the specific quality of belonging that comes from having been there when things were still being decided. She wrote about Thomas, who was 6 years old and attended his first 4th of July celebration as a citizen of a proper state, with the solemn interest of a child who has been given a great deal of context for a holiday. She wrote about Rose, who was 4 and had celebrated by stealing the entire population of icing from the celebratory cake that Virginia had made and distributing it to the barn cat with great generosity. The piece was the most widely shared column she ever wrote, reprinted in newspapers across the West, forwarded in letters, read aloud at gathering places. It was about belonging, about what it means to make your life in a place that is still becoming what it will be, and to become yourself along with it. She got more letters after that column than ever before. She answered every one. In 1891, they had their 3rd child, a boy they named Samuel, called Sam from the first week by his brother Thomas, who found the full name logistically inefficient. Sam was a placid, cheerful baby who seemed constitutionally undisturbed by the vigorous household he had arrived in, accepting the overwhelming attentions of his older siblings with the good-natured equanimity of a person who had arrived in the world with a secure sense of his own place in it. Wesley was 43 years old when Sam was born, Virginia 38. They were, by the standards of their time and the particular demands of frontier life, people who had lived with full intensity. They showed it, not in the way that diminishment shows it, but in the way that accumulation does, in the deepened quality of knowing each other, in the particular ease between them that is only available to people who have been through genuine difficulty together, and come out the other side still choosing each other. There was a morning, in the early summer of 1892, when Virginia came out of the house in the first light to find Wesley already standing at the edge of the porch, looking at the land. The children were still sleeping. The hands had not yet stirred in the bunkhouse. It was the quiet hour, the one that belonged to the day before the day began. She came and stood beside him. He put his arm around her without turning, the easy certainty of a man who knows where she is. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "About the letter I should have written," he said. She looked at him. "What letter?" "When I read the columns," he said, "in 1881, I thought about writing a letter to the paper. To VW I did not write it because I did not know what to say that would not sound like the kind of letter that a respectable editor would put directly in the fire." She stared at him. "You thought about writing to me?" "Yes," he said, "before we ever met." "Yes," he said. "I had the paper and the ink and I sat down at this desk twice and could not find the language for it. The second time I got as far as writing, I read your words about the cedar chest, which sounds like an unlikely beginning for a letter, and then could not continue." Virginia turned to look at him fully. The light was coming up over the mountains, doing its patient daily performance of making the world visible. "What would you have said," she asked, "if you had written it?" He thought about this for a long time, longer than his usual long silences. "I think I would have said," he said at last, "that I had read words that felt like they came from someone who understood what a life was supposed to be, not what it was usually described as, what it was actually supposed to be." He paused. "And that I had been trying to build toward that, and that if she ever found herself near Wyoming territory, I would be grateful if she would come and see what I had managed." Virginia looked at the man she had been married to for nearly 10 years, the man who had read her words in a newspaper and built them into cedar and larkspur, the man who had stood at a depot platform and taken her fallen bag into careful hands, the man who had told her the truth, even when the truth was the kind that sounds like a thing a man says rather than a truth. "That," she said, "would have been a very good letter." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she still was not done looking at, that she suspected she would not be done with for as long as she had eyes to look. "Would you have answered it?" he said. She thought about St. Louis and the rented room and the $47 and the particular kind of loneliness that comes dressed as sensible caution. She thought about the woman she had been in October of 1881, sitting at a small desk and writing with great precision about what a life could look like if it was built with intention. "Yes," she said, "I think I would have." They stood together as the light kept coming, steady and particular and entirely honest, over the mountains that had been there longer than any of them and would be there when all of them were gone, And Virginia felt the perfect coherence of the life she was inside, the way it had come together from unexpected directions into something she would not trade for anything she could imagine. The room was still the room. She had added to it over the years, a second shelf of books, a small writing table in the corner where she worked on the column when the study was occupied. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed held things now, real things, a blanket her mother had made, Thomas's first small boots, a letter from Ruth, the October 1881 issue of the Denver paper, folded to VW the larkspur returned every summer in the field to the east of the house, and every summer she dried some and put it in the glass jar on the shelf. It had become a ritual, the replacing of it each year, a small annual acknowledgement of the thing that had started before she arrived. One evening in August of 1892, she was sitting in the room writing in her journal, the window open to the warm evening air, when Thomas appeared in the doorway, 8 years old and full of the particular energy of a summer evening. "Mama," he said, "why is there always a flower in the jar?" She looked at the jar. At the dried larkspur, blue and light. "Your father put it there before I came," she said. Thomas considered this with the serious expression he brought to things he was trying to properly understand. "Before you met?" "Yes," she said. "Did he know you were coming?" She thought about this, about the newspaper and the cedar chest and the invisible preparation of it all, about the particular mystery of how things find their way to where they are supposed to be. "Not exactly," she said. "He was preparing for someone, and I was the person who arrived." Thomas thought about this for another moment, then appeared to find it satisfactory in the way that children sometimes find things satisfactory not because they fully understand them but because they sense the rightness of them at some level below understanding. "That is lucky," he said. "Yes," said Virginia. "It is." Thomas went back to whatever summer evening business he was about, and Virginia turned back to her journal. And outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the larkspur field in the long golden hour of the August evening. And everything that had led to this moment, the newspaper column and the loose platform board and the $47, and the room built in the November of 1881 for a woman who had not yet arrived, rested in the particular piece of things that have found their right place. She wrote in the journal for an hour, writing about what it was to look back at the shape of a life and see the pattern of it clearly, which you could only ever do from inside the life itself, never in advance, never from the outside, only from the vantage point of having been carried all the way through to the place where the pattern was visible. She wrote, "The most terrifying thing about love is not the loving but the allowing, the opening of the door, the setting down of the bag, the saying yes to the room that was built before you arrived, before you were known, built from the ghost of your own longing by someone who was also longing without knowing what for." She wrote, "The most remarkable thing is that it makes sense. Not the coincidence of it, not the mechanics of the columns and the newspapers and the depot platform. The deeper sense. The sense of two people who were, independently, building toward the same thing, and who, when they finally stood in the same room, recognized it." She heard Wesley's step in the hall and set down her pen. He appeared in the doorway as he had appeared in 100 doorways over 10 years, quiet and steady and entirely himself, holding 2 cups of coffee the way he sometimes did in the evenings, a small domestic gesture that still moved her precisely because it was small. He looked at her at the writing table, at the open journal, at the jar of larkspur on the shelf in the golden evening light. She looked at him. "Come in," she said. "Come sit with me." He did. He sat in the wooden chair by the window, the one that had been there since the beginning, and handed her the coffee. And outside the wind moved through the grass, and the stars began their patient accumulation in the enormous Wyoming sky. And the room held them both with the particular security of a place that was built, without knowing it, for exactly this. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow and to settle into the solid prosperity of a well-managed operation, and Virginia's writing continued to expand into the wider world, and Thomas grew into a young man of remarkable character, and Rose into a young woman of formidable intelligence, and Sam into a cheerful and determined boy who seemed to find the world an endlessly interesting place, which was perhaps the finest gift his parents had given him. The conviction that the world was worth looking at closely. The room remained the room. The larkspur remained in the jar. The cedar chest remained at the foot of the bed. The 3 books remained on the shelf, supplemented over the years by many others, but those 3 always there, always exactly placed. And Wesley Shelby remained, through all of it, the man who had built a room for a woman he had not yet met, from words she had written in a rented room in St. Louis, because he was a man who built things instead of only protecting them, who understood that preparation and longing could live in the same gesture, who had been patient enough and open enough and honest enough to allow a life to arrive that was better than anything he had known how to plan for. And Virginia Walker Shelby remained, through all of it, the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with $47 and a fierce determination, and the particular perceptive intelligence that could look at a room built before she arrived and understand that she was not looking at a trap or a strange obsession, but at evidence of a man who loved things enough to build for them before he knew their name. They grew old together on the Wyoming plains, in the house with the room that had been waiting, under the sky that held more stars than anyone from somewhere smaller could believe, in the life that had assembled itself from improbable pieces into something whole and specific and entirely theirs. And when people asked, as people sometimes did, how they had come to be together, they told the story of the room, and the larkspur, and the newspaper column, and the loose board on the depot platform, and the $47. And every time they told it, the story was slightly different in its details, and exactly the same in what it meant, which was that some things come together from improbable directions into a pattern that is only visible once you are inside it, and that being inside it, if you are very fortunate and also very brave, is the finest thing a life can offer.